You ever wonder how these huge, world-changing organizations actually get started? I mean, not with a bunch of fancy software or a high-powered C-suite, but with just a really powerful core idea? Well, today we're going to crack open a pretty fascinating blueprint for one of the most enduring institutions in history, the Christian Church. And we're looking at it through the eyes of the 16th century reformer, John Calvin. You see, Calvin was kind of obsessed with this one simple but really profound question. He wanted to know, before all the centuries of hierarchy and tradition piled on, what was the original design? How was the early church actually run? He was absolutely convinced there was a model, a blueprint, and he was determined to go back and reverse engineer the whole thing. Now, he wasn't trying to invent some new management theory or anything like that. No. Instead, he dug deep. He sifted through scripture and all these historical records to find what he called the original blueprint. And what he found was a structure that he believed was simple, divinely inspired, and, surprisingly practical for just getting things done. All right, so how did this blueprint actually work? We're going to break it down into 5 key parts. First, we'll look at the original blueprint itself, the basic structure. Then we'll get into this idea of leadership without lords. After that, we'll see what the preachers and caretakers actually did. Then there's this really cool part on the patrimony of the poor, which is all about money. And finally, we'll look at the people's choice, how leaders were actually selected. Okay, first up, the original blueprint. Now, according to Calvin, the ancient church didn't have some crazy, sprawling, complex org chart like we see today. Not at all. Instead, its entire ministry was organized around just 3 essential functions. It was lean, it was focused, and it was totally purpose-driven. So the whole system basically rested on this really clear 3-part division of labor. Think of it like a 3-legged stool. First, you had your pastors and teachers. Their main job was teaching scripture. Then you had what he calls moral censors. These were other elders or presbyters, and they were in charge of the community's moral well-being, handling corrections and disputes. And finally, you had the deacons. They handled all the practical stuff, caring for the poor, managing the money, and distributing aid. Each role was super distinct, but they all worked together for the same mission. All right, now this is where things get really interesting. How in the world did they manage leadership without creating this rigid, top-down pyramid we're all so used to? This next part is all about the unique relationship between the elders, the presbyters, and the person we'd now call a bishop. So get this, originally, the words bishop and presbyter pretty much meant the same thing. They were the same office. But, to keep meetings from turning into chaos and to prevent arguments, the Council of Presbyters would choose one of their own to be a presiding officer, and that person was the bishop. But think of it less like a CEO and more like the consul in the Roman Senate. They were a first among equals. Their job wasn't to boss everyone around, but to preside, gather opinions, and then carry out what the whole group decided. It was all about facilitation, not domination. And hey, this wasn't just Calvin's theory. He points directly to ancient writers like Jerome, who basically said, flat out, that this whole setup was a human custom. It was a practical solution to keep things from falling apart. So the bishop's authority didn't come from some divine right to rule. It came from the consent of his colleagues. It was almost like a startup-style flat hierarchy way back then. So, okay, what did these leaders actually do all day? Well, their duties were crystal clear, and they fell into 2 main buckets: spiritual teaching and practical care. Let's dive into how these roles actually worked. Okay, you can think of the presbyters and bishops as the engine room for teaching. Their number one, absolutely non-negotiable job was to preach and teach. In fact, Calvin points out that it was considered a monstrous failure for a bishop not to preach. Meanwhile, the deacons were the engine for practical care. They were the ones handling all the finances, the daily offerings, the yearly income, making sure the community's needs were actually being met. And that brings us to what might be the most countercultural, maybe even shocking, part of this entire blueprint: the church's philosophy on money. The early church had this totally radical view of its own wealth. Basically, they believed it didn't really belong to the institution at all. It was held in trust for the poor. So to make sure that wealth wasn't just being hoarded, the early church came up with this brilliant system for its income. Everything got divided into 4 equal streams. One part went to support the clergy. Another part went directly to help the poor. A third part was for maintaining the church buildings. And that final 4th portion, it was given to the bishop specifically for hospitality, for taking care of strangers and prisoners. It was like a built-in system of accountability. And believe me, this principle was tested in some pretty incredible ways. Calvin tells this amazing story about a bishop named Agassiz. There were thousands of Persian prisoners who had been captured and were literally starving to death. So what did he do? He didn't launch a fundraising campaign. He just melted down his church's sacred gold and silver vessels to ransom and feed every single one of them. And he famously said, "Our God needs neither plates nor cups, for he neither eats nor drinks."
Wow.
And this kind of thinking was everywhere. Bishop Ambrose of Milan said it even more directly. When people criticized him for doing the exact same thing, he argued that preserving vessels of living men was way more important than preserving vessels of metal. For him, the real beauty of the church wasn't in its gold. It was in its ability to care for people in crisis. It was always people over property. Okay, so you've got this structure of servant leadership, this radical generosity with money, but how did someone actually get into one of these positions? Well, the answer might surprise you. It wasn't some appointment from way up on high. It was a community decision.
It was this really smart three-part system of checks and balances. First, the clergy, who were already there, would select a candidate they thought was qualified. Then, that choice would be presented to the local magistrates or city leaders to think it over. And finally, and this is the most important step, the choice was brought before all the people for their consent. And here's the kicker. All three groups had to agree.
This was the ultimate safeguard. The ancient church held on tight to this principle that no leader could be forced on an unwilling community, period. As one early council put it, "Let him who is to be set over all be chosen by all." The consent of the people was absolutely 100% non-negotiable. So after looking at the structure, the leadership style, the approach to money, and the election process, what's really at the core of this ancient blueprint? What are the big ideas holding it all together? Let's boil it all down. It really comes down to three powerful core principles. First, you've got shared governance. Decisions were made by a council, not a single ruler. It was collaborative. Second, servant leadership. The whole point of being a leader was to teach and to serve, not to rule over people. And third, community consent. The people's voice was absolutely essential in choosing who would lead them. So what's the big takeaway from all this? If you strip away the specific religious context for a second, what you're left with is a blueprint for any organization that's built on shared governance, servant leadership, and genuine community buy-in. And these ideas, they feel incredibly modern, don't they? It really leaves you with a fascinating question to chew on. What could our own organizations, our companies, our nonprofits, even our local community groups, what could they learn from this ancient model for building something that truly lasts?